So how do you get an aphasia? Well, typically, you have some damage or insult to the brain. And, one of the more common kinds of insults are vascular, involving interruption of blood flow. You can have a stroke, right? You can have a burst vessel. You have an aneurysm where there's a weakness in the wall of the vessel, that with, over time it gets weaker, and then finally bursts. And typically for these various sorts of aphasias that we've been describing, particularly like Broca's and Wernicke's aphasia or conduction aphasia, which is rare. But you have damage to a particular artery that feeds, the lateral surface of the brain, the side of the brain, on the left side. It would be the left, what they call middle cerebral artery. It comes out of that lateral fissure and then, works its way along the side of the brain. It's a great big artery, great big vessel, but then splits into smaller vessels that are called arterioles, still carrying oxygenated blood from your lungs, right? And then that splits into smaller little capillaries, remember, where you can actually get the sharing of oxygen and glucose and other important, constituents of your diet, out into the tissue. So you got to constantly feed neurons and glial cells, the support cells in the nervous system, in order to allow them to continue to function, appropriately. And an interruption in that flow of blood is deadly. I mean, even within, minutes. I mean, very, very rapidly, these cells you will die. And so, if a stroke, blocks most of the middle cerebral artery, if you're so unlucky as to have, a great big clot of some sort that blocks the trunk as opposed to like a branch, right? Like if it's an anterior branch, a branch over the frontal lobe, you're likely to have production problems, right? Because if it's in the left hemisphere, because you're going to have problems with Broca's or the connection between Broca's and other regions that are components of, this network that's involved in speech and sign, right? In the frontal lobe. If you have a branch that's more posterior, like in, that takes out Wernicke's or, the angula gyrus or, portions of the temporal lobe, you're going to have more of a language comprehension problem, that results. But if you get more to the trunk of that middle cerebral artery and interrupt blood flow, well, you can have what's called a global aphasia. If you take out like a damage large areas, of the left hemisphere of your brain, you have significant problems with both comprehension and production, and that's a terrible, kind of situation to be in. If you damage, parts of the right middle cerebral artery on the right hemisphere, we often think about language being localized to the left hemisphere. Well, definitely people notice, in all right-handers and most left-handers, some significant loss of language comprehension or production, depending on the severity of, a stroke, for example, in the left hemisphere. But we're talking often about details of language, like the grammar, how to organize the utterance, the word choice, aspects that are very visible to others when, you're unable to come up with the right words and put them in the right order and express them. With right hemisphere damage, people tend to still speak fine. They're fluent. But what you lose are some of the more global and emotional aspects of language. So people with right hemisphere damage, interestingly, tend to have grammatically correct sentences, but they tend to have sort of more flat and less emotional speech. So they don't put a lot of prosody, that sort of sing-song quality of speech, that conveys a lot of information about, what it is you're trying to say, how important is it to you, The other significant aspect of language that seems to be lost with right hemisphere damage as opposed to left is the ability to kind of get to the point, to have some kind of global point of what you're trying to express. You don't have people with right hemisphere damage will have fluent, kind of flat emotionless speech, but they'll keep going on and on and on and on and never get to the point. Whenever I describe this, I worry that I am not actually reaching, my point. So I'm going to stop here.